Welcome, everyone. I'm not the right person to welcome you here. The right person is standing next to me. But it's a pleasure seeing you again, and so many people on time, even though you just had half an hour, and lots of things to discuss after the interesting hydrogen panel with you, Nico, at the City Hall. We are very pleased to be here, and we're thanking all of the Sparkasse team, in particular their, what's the equivalent in English, CEO, or what are you in? Yes, the CEO, okay. So, I'd like to hand over the word to the CEO of Sparkasse, Michael Wellershaus, who's been a very early supporter of future Cleantech architects and everything we do on decarbonizing industry in this region, because you have a couple of things to say.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Only a few words, dear ladies and gentlemen, esteemed representatives of the United Nations, dear guests. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you here in the Sparkasse. In a few countries, Sparkasse is called savings bank. But I'm not going to present you the Sparkasse in detail. Instead of this, allow me a few words, brief pre-opening to the classification and, due to my view, as a link to the panel. As a local and regional bank, it is particularly important to us how the people, and especially the companies in our city, are doing and how they are developing. From the perspective of future developments in the context of decarbonizing and the transformation towards more sustainable development, new tools of financing are, in my opinion, extremely important. Against this background, we are very pleased to welcome you here, and because local networking in connection with financing options and future viabilities for companies is part of the DNA of the Sparkasse. So we wish you a pleasant panel and an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. And that leaves me, without further ado, with introducing your moderator tonight. We've been working together with Future Cleantech Architects and Peter Sweatman from Climate Strategy Partners. He's their founder and CEO. He's been with JP Morgan previously. He's advised the European Commission. He has been in other roles, which he might refer to when leading this excellent discussions or this subject matter discussion on finance during the course of this panel. And he holds, and he rose in my view of him even more last night when we had a dinner of the Breakthrough Innovation Hub, and he brought one thing, and this is an original copy of the first scientific publication ever done on climate change. It's by Svante Arrhenius. It's from 1896. I know because I quoted it in my master thesis. And when he held it up, I thought, well, that's great, Peter. But he told me I can hold it, but I have to hand it back to him, which I'll do with this. I'll leave the floor to you. Thank you very much to everyone. We have an excellent panel tonight, and enjoy this discussion. Thank you.
So, Michael und Peter, meine Damen und Herren, es freut mich sehr, diese Veranstaltung in der Sparkasse Remscheid zu eröffnen. Die Sparkasse hat eine lange Tradition rund die Finanzierung von Innovationen. Von der Bergwerkzeugbranche bis zum digitalen Startup. Und dazu gehört in Zukunft auch Cleantech. Herzlich willkommen und vielen Dank. It is with some relief I now revert to my native tongue. Thank you for joining us for this last session of today. We hope to detain you momentarily before your evening calls. The subject of the session, of course, is financing breakthrough cleantech, and essentially the framing question or the framing statement is the fact that we are currently off track, and I actually a few years ago wrote a research piece that exactly said how far we were off track. But to give you a sense, we are probably financing clean tech innovation at a rate of about a half to a third of what is necessary to deliver net zero by 2050. And so particularly the conversations tonight are specifically relevant because innovation takes a long time to work and deliver to the scale that's necessary. And we really have to start now. So whilst it's true to say that as we repower Europe and we respond to shortages and high energy prices, we obviously need to think about how we use energy and to be very efficient. But at the same time, we can't cut back on the innovation spend that's necessary to build the future we need. So today, we have a great panel, and we actually have three extremely complementary panelists who are going to introduce themselves. But the way that you can think of them, and we've asked them, I mean, given their backgrounds, Pippa Gawley is really, to my mind, the voice of Cleantech seed investor, and she'll explain why. Tilman Kruse is the voice of the public sector and global venture capital cleantech investments. And Nico Köllner is the voice of making cleantech business cases work in practice. And he also has an energy and real estate background. So what I suggest we do, and please think of questions, difficult ones to answer our panel, but we're going to make this quick fire. We're not going to sort of talk for too long, each one of us, but why not start off by just a 2-minute introduction by each one of the panelists. Pippa.
Thank you. So I'm Pippa Gawley. I'm from the UK, and I'm the founding partner of Zero Carbon Capital. We're early stage, so pre-seed and seed stage investors in hard technologies that are addressing the fundamental problems of climate change that we think are not being addressed. So we think about the climate problem in a few different buckets and say, right, we think we've got pretty much everything we need to get on with halving emissions in the next 10 years. So we just need to get on and do that. But then, there'll be other emissions that are harder to abate that we don't yet have good solutions for. So in that bucket, we can put things like steel, cement, virtually all of agriculture and our food supplies. And there are lots of different solutions lots of different ways we can approach those problems. And it's those solutions that we are looking for and trying to find companies that are solving those in the most efficient and effective ways today, so that we can invest in them and support them so that in 5 years' time, when we need them to scale up, they'll be ready to go.
Hello, my name is Tilman Kruse. I'm the global head of early growth and venture capital at DEG in Cologne. We are part of KfW Group, which is the German state-owned promotional bank and one of the largest promotional structures worldwide with a balance sheet of north of 500 billion euro. At DEG, we are the arm of the group which is covering emerging markets globally. So my team looking into innovation, venture capital, and scaling young companies, both from a fund investment perspective and from a co-investment perspective, is based out of Cologne headquarters, but also globally in Singapore, Latin America, and several other places, also in emerging Europe. To give you an idea, we have a funds program of currently 2.3 billion committed, roughly another 1 billion committed in co-investments and direct investments in equity transactions in emerging markets worldwide. This is sector agnostic, obviously, but the green economy and also innovation and cleantech related verticals and sub-verticals play an increasing role. I'm in this for 15 years already, so I think I do have some insight into that. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. I'm Nico Köllner. I'm very pleased to be here tonight and have the opportunity to have a hopefully very lively discussion. I am Business Development Director at Investa Real Estate, a privately owned real estate developer and investor. And I have a long-standing history making business cases work in practice, because I think that's many times a problem, that they don't work. But we'll talk about that a little later. I started my career in renewables with energy corporation E.ON, and I've over a decade been developing and leading finance organizations in E.ON, both nationally and internationally, and am now looking at business development from a commercial perspective in the real estate space. I think, and I'm also, thanks to Peter, actively engaged with FCA. So I'm also acting as an energy and finance advisor on the expert side for FCA. I'm very proud of being able to actually be on that journey. And also, I have a 2- and a 4-year-old son and daughter, and I think that actually makes it very well worth investing time and energy into the clean tech journey, because they're the future.
Thanks. So we'll just, without perhaps further ado, so Pippa, you provide seed capital to the clean tech industry, and you've probably seen more innovators and met more innovators up close than most of us have. What do you think in Europe right now is really necessary to ensure that more funding is going into those companies?
So it's a very complex problem. There are bottlenecks and sources of friction at every kind of point on the scale. But fundamentally, the issue is that we're not moving fast enough as a society. So governments, corporates, the incumbent ways of doing things are not changing their ways, and so the sources of financing are not following. They're following suit and not moving fast enough. And I think if it comes down to us to things like the VCs that we work alongside, virtually all of them are looking for like the lowest risk companies they can invest in. And that means investing in things that look like they are low risk today or yesterday, and not really evaluating the world through the lens of what's going to be happening tomorrow. And I think even if people have that understanding and that knowledge that the world is changing and that is what the future holds, the realities of climate change, the costs of climate change, they're not yet proximate enough for us to really embody them in the kind of financial models of today. And unfortunately, the companies, the governments are not being visited with the costs that are being incurred with the way we operate today. But they are real costs. So what it really takes is for everybody to get behind the message that it's going to be cheaper for us to invest today to fix this problem than it is to pay in the future for the costs. And by the way, we'll still have to invest to fix it then as well. So it's like paying twice over. So not only is this like smart way to do things, it's a phenomenal investing opportunity. Probably the best we will ever see in this generation, and probably several generations from now. But it's also going to make a better world, for all of our children. One where the air is cleaner and people don't die of asthma the whole time, and the water is cleaner, and everything works more efficiently and more cleanly, and it's going to be great. That's my optimistic hat. But the alternative one that we're barreling towards is one where we have increasingly have these extreme weather events, flooding, people having health issues and suffering in heat waves and droughts. And we have these issues of resource scarcity coming up more and more as well. So I think these are the fundamental issues. Getting more specific, I think the private money in Europe needs to have greater risk appetite and bigger vision. I think we can take a leaf out of the books of the American investors here, and this is exactly what happened in software. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we didn't have the same vision, and we lost out. And a lot of our companies became global technologies in the US. That's going to happen in climate tech as well. We see it now that deals are being taken from smaller European investors by American investors who are willing to pay more. So we need to up our game. And in terms of the public money, I think grants are too often tied to kind of current policy by governments. So I think the governments need to again step up their game in terms of their future vision, and I think get creative around some of the solutions to help clean tech companies get off the ground, to de-risk their business models. So things like preferred purchasing or zero risk financing agreements that they're in a unique position to provide. So I think across the board we all need to up our game and really commit to this direction.
Thanks. I must say, I certainly kicked myself in my own personal journey over 20 years in climate of having seen businesses that have then turned into global sort of massive companies. And so I totally take your point. I would never have guessed, for example, that Tesla would be such a successful company, nor that, for example, lab food companies that listed on the New York Stock Exchange would have such successful IPOs and so on. But turning to you, Tilman, we talked a little bit about global markets, a bit the US here from Pippa, but you are looking increasingly at emerging markets. So tell us how the clean tech innovation space in emerging markets, for example, is different from Europe, and what are you learning as you invest there, and what can we learn from?
Thank you, Peter. So from an emerging markets perspective, things are obviously even more difficult. than Pippa absolutely correctly described for the developed markets world. And I would like to boil that down into 3 layers: the availability of financing, the maturity of ecosystems, and policies. So with regards to the availability of financing, I think it's crystal clear that large-scale innovation in the cleantech vertical requires patient and smart risk capital, right? So being one of, at DG, being one of the major sources of financing for private equity and venture capital in emerging markets, what we see these days is, let's say, something during the cycles which is pretty obvious and not necessarily positive for emerging markets. That is, if you have a combination of geopolitical risk and an interest rate hike, there is, well, not a reversal of money flows and large allocation decisions, but allocations to emerging markets, PE and VC in such an environment are more on a downward trend than on an upward trend during such a cycle. Simply because we're coming from, obviously, over the last funds, record fundraising volumes, particularly in VC. That might correct or not, but in any event, fundraising for GPs domiciled in emerging markets, given this is a broad spectrum, obviously, from frontier markets to rather developed BRICS markets, but still will become more difficult as it already is. So what we do expect is on the GP side, on the fund manager side, that, let's say, this situation will probably differentiate a little bit the let's say, the players in the market, lead to some consolidation, and obviously requires, let's say, also a government role in emerging markets, let's say, to compensate for this effect. Maturity of ecosystems, innovation is largely about ecosystem. Interestingly enough, on that one, over the years, we had a learning curve at DEG, seeing extremely competitive innovation in emerging markets. So we see both bottom-up, but also, if you want, top-down from the developed markets world, increasing interest, let's say, into innovation ecosystems in selected emerging markets. Very interesting stuff going on. I think the software story is relatively well known to everybody, but also in cleantech, and particularly in deep tech, interesting stuff is going on. And we also see deep tech-oriented investors from developed markets increasingly trying to embark on a bridge, let's say, with emerging markets players to benefit from that. However, obviously, the maturity of ecosystems in emerging markets, by and large, is not comparable to Northern America or the European Union. Last point is policies. Obviously, it would be unfair to say that emerging markets are policy laggard when it comes to clean tech, but obviously, let's say, they are not the locomotive in terms of policies, and there is a certain time gap in which governments, let's say, face the challenge, rise up to the challenge. So please assume that, let's say, when we discuss policy issues in a European Union context or a US context, this is definitely, let's say, much more ahead of the curve than what we see in emerging markets, and I think we will more deep dive, let's say, during the discussion and what that means in more detail. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, picking up a little bit on the fact that I know you invest a lot in digital in the real estate space, the digital and the green transitions are very much connected. And so, I mean, perhaps, Nico, you could tell us, how do innovators in that space find their business models being enabled by both those pathways in Europe?
Yeah, I think obviously both topics are incredibly broad and complex when you interlink them. But what I see, what we're seeing, when you bring it down to solving real life problems, it's a lot easier and you get a lot of traction. So as an example, in the digital space, in real estate, we're seeing access management systems, for example, and digital space management solutions actually being wanted and demanded by customers a lot, which obviously has positive side effect. You have better space management, it makes it more efficient, you make it more flexible also for different users. At the end of the day, that makes it also more sustainable from both an economic as well as from, for example, energy use perspective. So that's one thing. A lot of digital solutions are out there, but the ones that are most successful are the ones that actually solve a customer problem, which is almost always the case. And then on the other side, or the other thing that I'm seeing is the best things happen when you connect the dots. So when we have, for example, the connection between energy and real estate, I'm currently in the process of setting up a company that is focusing on using excess heat from data centers to provide district heating to commercial parks, which is obviously a huge potential because you have a lot of excess heat from the data centers. It's readily there, and it's a win-win situation both for the carbon footprint of the data center as well as for providing sustainable heating, and you can also then extend that to cooling for commercial parks. So that's a very neat opportunity, but you can find those in many different pockets if you look out for them attentively and actually then have the opportunity and also the boldness to use them. I think it's important to solve a real life problem and be attentive and open to actually spotting those opportunities to connect the dots.
And just a quick follow-up question. A lot of people are concerned about privacy issues with respect to because sensors everywhere and knowing the temperature in buildings and what you're doing in them. Is that a concern for the sort of green digital sort of transition in Europe?
I think you need to look out for data protection and data sensitivity everywhere. So you obviously need to be aware of those and deal with those sensitively. When you have access management systems, you obviously do process personal information of people. When you have space management systems also, we find that these are solvable issues.
That's kind of what I was hoping to hear, actually. Back to sort of potentially now thinking a little bit about the roadblocks. We heard a bit about the enablers and sort of Pippa. You said to me when we were preparing, you said venture capitals used to do hard things all the time, but no longer. So can you sort of explain a bit about that and tell us how you might want to change that?
Yeah, so what I meant by that was just that, before we had software and the internet, that's what VCs did, was that they took on venture, like adventures. They had a thesis about the world and how the world was going to change, and they provided the financing for people to make exciting, valuable change happen. And then somewhere along the line in the 80s, they got kind of hooked on software because it's scalable and you can make it grow quickly, and it provides the illusion of faster returns than building Intel or Marconi or financing a whaling ship, which is how VC started out, right? So that seemed easier, but again, it kind of comes back to this point of it's only actually easier if that plays out with all of the companies that you're investing in. So I think lots of software companies don't have an exit within 10 years, and most of them, virtually all of them, don't become unicorns, right? So we've got to look at the risk and the reward. So for all of VCs to say, right, well, yes, because all of the most successful companies of the last 30 years have been digital companies, they're just sticking with that playbook and saying, right, we're only going to invest in digital. And of course, not all problems can be solved with digital technologies. So we solely focus on physical scientific innovations, on hard tech, as we call it. There were some problems we can solve with software, and I think things like making existing infrastructure more efficient, fantastic. Giving more transparency over the flows of money or the data that we need to understand this problem. That can help allocate resources more efficiently. That's great. But we currently are in this ridiculous situation where the vast majority of VC money is going into digital solutions for climate, most of which are not actually going to have the impact that they say that they will, or are double counting impact. And ultimately, best case scenario, they will move money towards some of the actual solutions, but the VCs aren't funding those actual solutions. So it is frustrating when we support companies and they just hear again and again and again that they can't get money from VCs. And us, we're looking for LPs for our fund, and again we have people saying, well, wouldn't you just include a bit of software in there just to balance out the portfolio? It's like, well, no, because our value thesis is not based upon that. So we see it as our differentiator and source of value. So I think that's a real roadblock, and I think it comes down to again that the incumbents are not being sufficiently incentivized to move quickly. I think if the corporates were being penalised, if governments were being penalised for just continuing business as usual, then there would be more incentive for the VCs, for the other sources of capital to invest in these kind of innovative solutions that require physical change, and into infrastructure and into scaling those difficult problems. Because we do know how to do it. When we look around the world, you know, we have all these buildings, we have all these roads, we have all these solar panels and airplanes and ships, and we know how to build big things, right? So we can do it again. We just need to do it a little bit differently. And that's what fills us with hope, is when we find businesses which have got a scientific innovation, and that we're going to be able to scale it using existing, you know, techniques and production and, you know, financial structures. Those ones are the ones where we think we can get them to market the most quickly. So that's something we can look out for, and that means that, you know, not all hard tech is going to be hard to fund. So yes, I think, yeah, coming back to that real costs being visited upon the people who are, you know, making this happen at the moment.
So Tilman, are you to blame, given your 1,200 companies? How many of them are digital? And if you don't have enough clean tech in there, what do you think the barriers to you seeing more portfolio companies in the clean tech space globally?
Well, yeah, at first to explain that, so 1,200 is the total number of underlying portfolio companies in our funds portfolio. And in addition, we are directly invested, I think it's some close to 70 companies in emerging markets worldwide as an equity investor and minority shareholder. I'll try to talk a little bit on the innovation and clean tech side, but just as a kind of collegial reminder, obviously, and to add some flavor and grip to that emerging markets discussion, is that the spectrum, obviously, which is relevant, is much broader, right? If you talk, let's say, the decarbonization of the industrial decarbonization in emerging markets, let's say, with a lot of high polluters, that is enormously complex and difficult. Also, agricultural emissions are in many emerging markets really a problem which needs to be tackled. But I will try to focus on the innovation and clean tech side a little bit. So what we see as a roadblock is basically that if you look at ecosystems, innovation ecosystems in developed markets, a little bit like you were alluding to, in the digital space, many ecosystems are, let's say, used to digital technologies and come to market time of roughly 3 to 5 years. In clean tech, let's say, with heavy R&D, with often very product-driven founders, maybe from an academic background, let's say, which then need to become company builders over time, I think it's not a purely EM phenomenon that on the risk capital side, on the VC side, let's say, really patience is needed, technological insight and expertise is needed, and the vision, let's say, to back founders to solve a real problem in hopefully a large total addressable market. While the roadblock in emerging markets is not the availability of sophisticated founders, more the opposite. The big difference to developed markets is that patient risk capital is available, let's say, on a much more selective basis than in developed markets. With funds, let's say, specifically looking at emerging markets, I think that is, in clean tech, a relatively narrow space. We have recently seen some larger vehicles being raised, and we also do welcome a development that larger GPs from developed markets are trying, let's say, to kind of open up their universe also to kind of bridge thinking from the developed markets world into emerging markets. I think that is very, very important. And the reason for that scarcity is basically one big difference to developed markets on the financing side. If you look at the pockets of money behind the funds investing, in the developed market world, obviously, and hopefully on an ever-increasing basis, given ESG, given the necessity to be green, let's say, and to deliver on that, most institutional investors, be it private pension funds, be it insurance, be it endowments, be it also large family offices, let's say, increasingly open up to that trend. In emerging markets, it's mostly, the spectrum is broad, obviously, as said, but mostly there is close to zero availability of domestic institutional money, because simply reforms are missing, let's say, to mobilize local institutional monies, insurers, pensions into private equity, not to speak of venture capital. So the competition from a founder's perspective for VC money is extremely competitive, and also the fundraising volumes are more limited than in developed markets, which is, from our perspective, a pity, because as said, from a founder side, from innovation side, there is very many interesting things going on. At the same time, the kind of insight or takeaway by regulators, but also in particular by governments, or let's say the respective local arms, which would be available to compensate that, to do something around that problem, for example, outside of the grants dimension, for example, but to think a little bit from a domestic emerging markets perspective, how to mobilize money into these kind of situations, deep tech, tough tech, however you would like to call it, clean tech situations, is also lagging behind in a sense that many governments have not waken up, let's say, as in developed markets, that there is a chance, for example, by way of, let's say, offering structured funds with first loss pieces by a certain government entity, like here in Germany, the German Future Fund, which will have a deep tech pocket, for example, is then backed up by a mix of public investors like KfW, but also the German industry players. Let's say, instruments like that are hardly seen in emerging markets yet. And I think that is a challenge. It's a big chance, let's say, to overcome the fundraising issue. But I think we will only see over the next years in which jurisdictions and what places emerging markets governments open up, let's say, to really changing that and doing what they can, let's say, to create an ecosystem which is not only, which it is already attractive on the innovation side, but let's say allows for, let's say, founders and VCs to tap sufficient sources of institutional money in particular.
So, Nico, you work specifically with some of these sophisticated founders. There's no shortage of great founders out there. But if you had to provide sort of ways, or you had to help these founders avoid these roadblocks, which you've just heard Pippa and Tilman describe, what would you say? How would you help them?
I think one thing that we've and I've seen a lot is that obviously founders struggle to actually find partners that take the risk and are willing to actually deploy their solution, be it a digital solution or a hard tech solution. I think that is a main roadblock that needs to be overcome. And I think that applies to, we've heard it in other sessions today as well. I think the collaboration and the ecosystem piece is incredibly important to overcome some of those roadblocks, to actually get new technological solutions that may not yet be proven, but that hold a lot of potential, to get them into the market, to get them into application with also larger industrial players, corporates, and actually help them to develop that industrial readiness and to be able to be developed at scale, so to actually make the impact that they're promising. And on the other side, I also think that it's required also for founders to be open to actually share the ideas they have and also the ins and outs of their product, because a lot of the solutions we're looking for are really complex, and they're not going to be working on a standalone basis to solve the problems that we have. So learning from each other, teaming up, making sure that you have the right people by your side can actually be, from my perspective, a great accelerator and a great ingredient for success. And on the other side, I think what I've also seen and I've been discussing a lot is make not only your own business case work, make the customer business case work. I've seen many solutions in many business cases that were super nice on paper, but they didn't work for the customer. We just couldn't make them work, because maybe it was too expensive, payback was too long. So make sure that you engage on the customer business case regularly and early on, so you don't get stuck with a great product that nobody actually wants to buy.
Thank you. So now perhaps we'll give a turn to the floor. For those of you who have questions, so we've talked a bit about complexity, issues with risk appetite, a lack of patience, particularly in emerging markets, no shortage of smart people, lack of development equity sources and financing instruments across the board. So would any of you like to raise questions to our panel? Now would be a good time for that. Thomas.
Share the microphone.
Oh, the mic.
Yeah. I guess two questions, but like a general one and then a more specific one. So, what role, if any, do you see for policy in ensuring that we have more money going more fastly to clean tech innovation? So you can also answer for, imagine makers, whatever you know best. And then a specific question, like if you had like 30 seconds with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, what would you ask her to do?
Great questions, thank you. We'll take some more. So while you consider your answers to that, we're going to take 3 questions. So we're going to wait here until the 2 other questions come. Otherwise, you're going to be late for the drink. Right.
I'll hand the mic over, and in the meantime, I just want to say how great Thomas' question is with the 30 seconds. Ben, your turn.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on some comments that were made about risk appetite, particularly when looking at Global South and developing countries. When looking at discount rates to make investment decisions, do you think there should be a premium, well, not a premium, a discount to that discount rate for clean technologies that will help us deal with climate change? So, for example, at a social discount rate, as often used in public services, or should that be at a sort of normal commercial lending level? And within your investments, how are you looking at them from a commercial perspective? Are you looking at them to also reflect the social benefit they bring, or are you looking at it purely from a competitiveness perspective with other investments as they normally would be? Thank you.
That's a great question. There's time for just one more. I know someone's got it. No one? Yes. Well done. Thank you.
So my question refers to who would kind of just spend the money to finance these clean tech innovations? And I mean, Pippa said that it would be cheaper to just kind of finance it now and get more capital to it. But I mean, who would do it now, and who would kind of bring some money into these innovations to kind of save our tomorrow?
Brilliant, thank you. Well, great questions, all of them. What I'll do is I might play them back to certain members of the panel. Pippa, I'm actually going to start with you and ask you this question on who. Who do you talk? I mean, who do you talk to? Who gives you money to lend with, and then who invests after that? Who are the who's?
I think there are people who kind of get the solution and the vision at kind of all levels. So sure, there's government money going to this kind of solution at all levels in terms of grants, incubators, accelerators, VCs, like larger pools of later stage capital, loans, debt, the works. Then there are kind of more individual investors. So there might be people who are personally motivated, either as angel investors or what we call super angels. And we have a lot of these kind of billionaires who set up their own funds. Some more guided by the science than others. Then family office type investors as well. We have institutionals, so for example pension funds who by definition have an eye to the future, so they can be a great source of investment as well, but again they need to have the vision and not just be very, very risk averse. So there are different sources of capital at each stage of the stack, and the good news is that more and more every day we see institutions or individuals in each of those groups who are kind of turning to this and saying, yep, got it, let's go, and let's make it happen as quickly as possible. And I think, if anything we've learned over the last 2 years, it's like that we can make things happen very quickly if we want to. Sometimes it takes governments to push that through. But more people will die this year, many more times people will die this year from air pollution than will from COVID in the whole of the last 2-3 years. So, it's clear that this problem is with us now, and people are dying because of it. So, hopefully, that's something that will continue to motivate individuals and organisations to move towards this. And we can all play a part as well. So we can't all be LPs in funds. We can't all buy Teslas even, but we can all vote. So be careful who you vote for. Most of us will have pensions or some kind of savings somewhere. Make sure you know what it's invested in, and change where it is. Make sure it's not going into fossil fuels or other things that you personally don't like. And if that money moves, if that pension money moves, if this savings money moves, that will be the single biggest change that any of us can make. So go away and make sure that you're doing those things and that you're out there talking to people to try and make that change happen.
Thank you. Tilman, I think for you, risk capital, so you're a public bank that invests through DEG into companies across the world. Do you consider different types of discount rates, social discount rates, in terms of solutions that deliver the climate problem?
Well, I can probably only answer that question, let's say, from the logic of our business model. And at DEG, being a public institution, it needs to be understood that there is zero German taxpayers' money, let's say, we are investing. The business model enjoys a single privilege, and that is that we are allowed to retain our earnings and reinvest our earnings. We're not paying dividends to our shareholder KfW because we are a high-risk global emerging markets balance sheet. We need to have equity buffers which are far north, let's say, of commercial banks, let's say, to absorb the risk, right? And at the same time, having, let's say, close to market return expectations, we're obviously one of the leading ESG investors worldwide. So we are driving ESG in many instances, also in measurement and tools. From that perspective, let's say, acting, let's say, in the private sector worldwide, at our end, let's say, we are calculating returns on a portfolio basis. So return ambitions do not necessarily need to apply for a particular investment. But if we're talking venture capital, I think we need to see, let's say, one thing, let's say, in either vertical like Cleantech or others. A venture capital kind of investment situation is a high-risk situation, obviously. Many fail, right? For such kind of investment at our end, there would not be a social discount. However, what we drive or try to drive as a discussion is, and it would be interesting, let's say, how you view that, to drive a little bit the discussion, let's say, whether the traditional venture capital model is really, let's say, fit for purpose when it comes to, let's say, tough tech and deep tech in the clean tech vertical. Because as you will know, usually those are closed-end funds with a 10-year lifetime. So if you, let's say, coming from a very R&D intensive, let's say, situation, I think you can question whether a fund life of 10 years, 5 years investment period, then portfolio companies need to be exited within the next 5 years. If that is a really suitable model, if you already know from day one that your come to market time probably is more than 2 or 3 years, right? So that is a discussion around, let's say, fund terms for clean tech funds, deep tech funds. I think we see out of North America, also out of Europe, let's say, from institutional investors, an increasing understanding that such kind of vehicles, let's say, should be designed, let's say, to be more patient and allow for more time for that cycle. Let's say in the extreme, that could be evergreen funds, but it could, let's say in the middle, could be simply, let's say, a bit more flexibility versus the usual LPGP model, right? However, let's say, I think it's about an instruments mix at the end of the day. If you're looking at the private sector, VC segment, as always, if the VC industries is delivering the big success stories in a particular vertical, that would ease fundraising, right? And I think it's about the mix, right? You need to have private sector money in that, you have to peace, but also, let's say, grants and the public institutions, I think, have a role to play in there to balance it out at the end of the day. Maybe one comment on borrowing costs. You mentioned that also, discount rates, not social discount rates, but borrowing costs, if that is also part of your question. I think that is a very important feature to look at, let's say, given the interest rate hikes looking forward. If you look at startups, I mean, basically that is equity driven, that is VC. Okay, there is venture debt, but probably that is not dominating the market, right? So that is really about the availability of patient, smart risk capital from an equity perspective. However, if we talk hydrogen, if we talk any kind of super capex intense investment in an, let's say, green economy context, right? Then it gets different because obviously borrowing costs over the next decade, let's say, will differ big time from the last decade. And that is probably, let's say, an issue, let's say, to look at in terms of financing mix, debt equity ratios in project finance, et cetera, which one will need to see, let's say, depending on certain market segments where the market balances out, but we are in a transition phase there on borrowing costs, and that obviously trickles down, let's say, to the available financing options in capex intensive projects. Again, even higher problem in emerging markets versus developed markets, but a tough call anyway.
You're right. That is one of the most significant factors that's going to impact the competitiveness of Cleantech. Nico, I think what I'm going to do, and as a part of our closing session, I'm going to wrap Thomas's two questions into the top tips that we were going to end on originally by saying, Thomas wants to know what the role of policy is for your startup founders and your Cleantech crowd. So perhaps you can think about top tips to the startup founders, what policies that they're going to need, and then close with your 30 seconds to von der Leyen, and then we'll go to Pippa, and then we'll go to Tilman with the same 3 questions.
Okay, that's a good challenge. I'll try and make it brief. I think I'll start with the policy one. I think that's super specific to individual businesses with regard to kind of the policy frameworks they need. I think policy frameworks and support from governments for developing startups and technologies. I think first of all, they need to be simple. A lot of the times today, especially in Germany, it's super hard to actually find out what can you apply for, how much do you get, the paperwork, etc. and so forth. So most people are actually getting torn off before they even get to applying, with a slight exaggeration. So I wish for policy to be simple and accessible. I think that's, and obviously then directed towards Cleantech. The advice to management teams, I think, again, focus on kind of making the business case work. I think one is invest time in your business case. It's not only about the product. Of course you need a product or a service, but you need to invest time in your business case, and not only once, but continuously. You basically need to live and breathe the business case day in, day out, and have it challenged. Don't keep it to yourself. Have it challenged by people from different perspectives. So open it up 360 degrees, so you make sure they actually have a solid business case that will help with everything, financing, developing the business, etc. and so forth. Then I think it's really important to enact controls early on. Don't oversteer, but know where you stand, and also to focus. I've seen a lot of times that people get carried away with a lot of ideas and application areas and this and this and that. Focus on your core and make sure that works, and when that works, you gain freedom to actually then broaden your portfolio. And then the last tip, I would say, get a good CFO, or a financial advisor, and actually actually trust them that they know what they're talking about, even if they don't, even if they're not the techie, or the one that understands the ins and outs of your technological solution. And then my 30 seconds to Ursula von der Leyen, and I'm not taking the stance of actually being able to judge on the complexity of her job. And I'm a great fan of the European Union. I think it's really important that it continues to grow, stabilize, and prosper. I would say invest into communication that everybody understands. So plain English for plain people. Second is spend more time on the ground. So invest into time with founders, financiers, people that actually face real life situations. I'm sure she does, but it's always helpful to do that. And thirdly is I wish her the courage to take bold decisions, because I think leadership in these days is not about finding the smallest common denominator, but I think it's time for bold political decisions.
Great, thank you. Pippa, perhaps we can ask you. So the questions are policy recommendations, top tips or recommendations in general to increase the seed clean tech investment field, and then your 30 seconds to the President of the Union.
So from a policy perspective, obviously I would love to see a carbon tax that went some way towards visiting those real costs on the companies that are producing those costs. I keep getting told that's not going to happen. I'll keep trying. In the meantime, you know, it's up to all of us to make that cost happen in other ways through financial pressure, through public pressure, through shareholder pressure. You know, the governments can do a lot more than they are. I mean, that's a sweeping statement because all the governments across Europe are very different. I too am a big fan of the European Union. Yeah, they can do a lot more in terms of helping with the cost of financing, making sure they're supporting fundamental scientific innovation, and you know, at all stages. So I think that's something that policy needs to be really serious about. They can also put a lot of pressure onto companies and to stand up to companies where, you know, rather than bending, you know, there's been many cases in the UK, sadly, in recent years where the government has given into you know, huge corporate lobbying over things like, you know, oil and gas licenses for extraction or building a new coal mine. It just doesn't add up to legally binding net zero targets, which we all need to start acting like we really have internalized and are acting towards. And the corporates need to do the same thing. They need to have legally binding scientific targets that they're holding themselves accountable to, rather than just talking about it, talking about these things that they're spending maybe 5% of their capex on, and 95% is still going into oil and gas. So more accountability at every stage of the scale. I think I would echo you in not trying to understand the complexities of the Ursula's job, but you know, I think she probably gets it and is doing what she can. But I think it's a shame, isn't it, that what you can do is so often limited by what we are currently doing.
I think was it Roosevelt who said, "I know now what I have to do. You just have to make me." Isn't that a bit what
Yes.
VDL needs to do?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, yes. Tilman, you've got policies, recommendations, and then your 30 seconds with our President.
Policies from an emerging markets perspective. What we do see is that the private sector has a role to play, obviously, in particular in clean tech and emerging markets. So from a promising, let's say, perspective, we would be delighted if governments in emerging markets do their utmost to deliver a comprehensive, non-contradictory framework and create an investment climate which facilitates private investment in these markets, in particular on the deep tech and venture capital side, in all aspects that has, across corporate law, tax, compliance, let's say making those jurisdictions investable, in particular also for Western institutional money, let's say, to back the initiatives on the ground. Second thought on policy from an emerging markets perspective is timing with regards to the manufacturing side of things and the industrial decarbonization. Many corporates in emerging markets, obviously, if they are exporters, let's say, compete via their cost basis. And sometimes are afraid, let's say, of standards, let's say, being increased, etc., etc. So governments need to get their timing right and their balance right, but obviously, let's say, should not underweight, let's say, the importance of increasing standards also to drive innovation from a regulatory standpoint. If I would ever in my life enjoy 30 seconds with Ursula von der Leyen, probably my point would be that we find it at DG these days quite difficult to read, let's say, how the world is changing, right? We are good corporate citizens here in Germany, obviously. We are Europeans. There's a lot of talk of digital sovereignty, etc., etc. All of that is great. But if you look at hydrogen alone, let's say, what about supply chains in clean tech verticals, or in particular in hydrogen, which is a field where we expect large changes, not only within Europe, but also with regards to emerging markets and maybe on the interface. So let's say, what does that mean to the EU Commission? Let's say, what is the vision, let's say, for an emerging markets cooperation, in particular in the hydrogen field? I would love to hear your thoughts.
Brilliant. Well, we actually just have 5 minutes to go, so I'll spend 20 minutes doing a wrap. What I thought is I'd like to basically give a round of applause to all of you and to our panel, so that was a really interesting. And as we so often say these days on our Zoom calls, I'll perhaps give you 5 minutes additional back to your lives. But before you go, I thought that if I happen to see our president in the lift going down from the Sparkasse to the nice drinks reception, which no doubt will be ready for us, I would say we need to own our own clean tech future. And we need to be the future architects of the policies, the finance, and the human capital of that clean tech revolution. So with that, good night.